also have fungi. And fungi involve in enzymes.
I want to welcome Paul Shapiro, which is a cultivated meat entrepreneur. He's the CEO of the Better Meat Company, a business-to-business ingredient company. He's also the author of the bestseller book, Clean Meat, How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. He's the host of the Business for Good podcast, as well as being TEDx and conference speaker about cultivated meat and alternative proteins. Please welcome Paul Shapiro.
Thanks so much, Natalia, and great to be with everybody. Greetings from California. It's wonderful to chat with you. I would say good morning on my time zone. I think for many of you, it is actually more like good afternoon or maybe even good evening. But it's great to be talking with all of you, and thanks so much for taking the time to chat. So I'm Paul Shapiro, the CEO of the Better Meat Co. And I want to just tell a brief story about the problem that we're in. So we all know that the planet is not getting any bigger. Humanity's footprint on the planet is getting much bigger, but the planet itself is not getting any bigger. And one of the primary ways that we leave that footprint is through our food print, principally in the amount of meat that we eat. Because if you are attending this conference virtually, you likely already know that it just takes a lot of land, a lot of water, a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of animal cruelty and more in order to raise billions of animals for food. And so the problem is that merely knowing about these facts generally is not sufficient to change people's behavior. Generally knowing about the fact that it is very resource intensive to produce meat does not actually lead to people eating less meat. In fact, today, more meat consumption is occurring than ever before in the history of planet Earth. So per capita meat consumption is higher than it has ever been. And population is rising too. So first we have increasing middle classes in places like China and India and Brazil and Mexico, where they want to eat more meat, just like the way that many people in Western Europe and the United States do. Well, that's great that they're escaping poverty. That's what we want, but there are externalities that mean it's going to be a lot more energy inefficient to produce all the meat that they want. Then you have to consider the fact that today there are nearly 8 billion human beings walking around on the planet. And by the year 2050, there's likely to be another 2 billion of us walking around, presuming there's no catastrophe before then. So how are we going to produce enough meat to feed not only the people currently here who want to eat more meat, but also for the billions more who are coming? We don't have any other celestial bodies to farm. We're not going to be farming the moon. We're not going to be farming Mars. We only have one celestial body to farm, and that is the Earth. So we are going to have to get a lot more efficient about how we produce meat. Well, there's a few ways to do it. So we could simply ask people to just eat less meat, right? You just say, let's eat more bean and rice burritos. Let's eat more lentil soup. Let's eat more hummus. Those are all great foods. I love eating them myself. I wish more people would like to eat them. But sadly, people seem to actually want that meat experience. So there is an entire movement now unfolding, led by many of the people who you've heard from already at this conference, to try to replicate the meat experience without having to raise and kill animals. So for example, right now, when you walk into a room and you flip on that light switch, what you want is the experience of an illuminated room. You aren't thinking about whether it's coming from fossil fuels or whether it's coming from renewable. You just want light in the room. Similarly, when people eat meat, generally speaking, they are not thinking about whether animals were raised and slaughtered for that food. In fact, if they did think about it, they probably would prefer that the animals not be raised and slaughtered for it. And so in the same way that we can produce light from renewables or from fossil fuels, increasingly, we are able to produce meat either through slaughtering animals or without slaughtering animals. And I would bet that many people, if given the choice, would be quite thrilled to be able to enjoy the meat experience to satisfy their meat tooth, so to speak, without the need to raise and slaughter animals. And I'll tell you a brief story about it. So here in California, very recently, a group of cows escaped from a slaughter plant. And they fled for their lives and they walked around residential neighborhoods in San Diego. As you can imagine, most people watching this story on the news or the people who were seeing what was happening, most of them were rooting for the cows, even though they eat meat. they were rooting for the cows who had fled for their lives and hoping that they would find freedom. Sadly, nearly all the cows were rounded up and slaughtered, but the fact remains that people wanted them to be free. And even though they eat meat, which is further evidence that people want meat, they don't necessarily want slaughter. So what can we do? What can we do to give them the meat that they want without having to raise animals? Well, we could do like what Mark Post is doing, who you heard from earlier in the conference, and actually try to produce real meat grown from animal cells without the need to raise animals. He has been doing that now for a decade or so and is a real leader in the space. And that's what the topic of my book, Clean Meat, is about. This movement to grow real meat without the need to raise and slaughter animals. That's one option, but it's only one of many options. To go back to the fossil fuel example, just like there are many alternatives that we need, wind, solar, geothermal, and more, there are lots of alternatives to the factory farming of animals that we need. Cultivated meat is just one of them. Reducing meat by eating things like bean and rice burritos, another one. Well, another one is making, instead of going to the animal kingdom, going to the plant kingdom, where you can take plants and do what companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat are doing and try to make plants have the texture of an animal's flesh. And they're doing that very well, but it takes a lot. It takes a lot to make a plant taste like an animal. It's because evolutionarily, they are very far apart from one another. So in order to do it, what you have to do is essentially grow, let's say, a field of peas. If you're talking about pea protein, you have to grow a field of peas, harvest that field of peas, mill it into a flour. Then you've got a pea flour that's less than 20% protein. Then you've got to subtract the fiber, get rid of the fat, concentrate that protein source down to the point where you have a pea protein powder that may be high in protein, but is still not textured like animal meat. You run it through a process called extrusion, which heats it up and causes a lot of pressure to change the molecular structure of the protein. So instead of being globular like a plant protein, it becomes stringy, more like an animal protein, and that becomes the basis of your plant-based meat. However, there's an entirely other kingdom that we can select from, because there's more than two kingdoms. There's not just plants and animals. You also have fungi. And fungi, while an entirely different kingdom, are not right in the middle. So you've got plants, you got animals. It's not like fungi are right in the middle here. They are way closer to animals here. And so fungi are so much closer to animals evolutionarily that, like us, they breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2, which, as we know, is the opposite of what plants do. Plants breathe out oxygen and they breathe in CO2. Like animals, fungi have to go out and search for their food and digest it. You know, plants just put themselves in the sun and they absorb the sunshine, and they are their own solar panels, basically, and they photosynthesize. Whereas fungi, like animals, have to go out and have to actually find food and digest it. So we know that fungi are much closer to animals, so much so that we know that mushrooms have a much more meat-like texture than do plants. In fact, mushrooms have been used for centuries as a meat substitute in Asian cuisine because mushrooms are so much meatier in their texture than are plants. However, there are a few problems. Mushrooms don't have a lot of protein. They take a while to grow. They can be finicky. Well, what if, though, instead of using mushrooms, we could still rely on the fungi kingdom, but instead of growing the mushroom, which is the fruiting body of a fungi, we relied on that root structure beneath the fungi, which is called mycelium or mycoprotein, because mycelium is actually a high protein, rapidly growing part of the kingdom that we can turn into something that has a meat-like texture. And that is what we at the Better Meat Co. are doing. We are running a fermentation platform that allows us to take common ingredients like potatoes, feed them to microscopic fungi in a microbial fermentation, and transform those potatoes within hours into foods that have the texture of meat. And unlike with plants, which require all types of processing to get them to be more animal-like, again, milling them, fractionating them, isolating them, extruding them, and so on, we don't have to do any of that. As soon as we take our product out of the fermenter, we simply remove water and it is automatically a meat-like texture. So in the same way that a cow eats grass and converts that grass into a steak, our little microbes eat potatoes and convert that starchy food into a high protein food. But unlike a cow, which takes more than a year before you slaughter her, Our microbes do it in hours. And so what we are capable of doing is taking a starchy food that's about 1% protein, like a potato, and in a matter of mere hours, convert it into a meat-like textured food that has 45% protein. So 1% to 45% within mere hours. And this could be, I think, among the most efficient ways that we could produce protein and a meat-like experience for the human population, because it does not rely on the types of raising of animals that is right now the way that we get protein. So I really believe that, for example, many people today, they think about protein as being synonymous with a hunk of flesh from a slaughtered animal's body. In the future, though, people are going to have a far more diverse set of definitions and connotations when it comes to protein. When people think protein in the future, they're going to think about animal cell culture, plant-based protein, microbial protein, hybridized protein, and more. And so this type of fermentation using the fungi kingdom, I believe, is one of the most promising methods of creating a very sustainable type of succulent protein that requires very little processing, is an all natural process. Merely what we're doing is taking a natural process, wrapping it in stainless steel, and allowing ourselves the opportunity to speed it up, to make sure that it happens quickly so that we can actually get this process down and optimize it. Now, there's a lot that needs to be done here. We're not yet at the point where this is a fully optimized process. So for example, if you think about with animals, we have domesticated animals for centuries. And so if you were to start, let's say your own chicken farm today, or let's say your own egg farm, the birds who you would be using lay a lot of eggs. You know, if you started an egg farm 100 years ago, you might only get a few dozen eggs per year. Well, today, if you start an egg farm with the chickens, because they've been selectively bred for generations, instead of a few dozen eggs a year, you're gonna get 300 eggs a year. So you have a much greater, more efficient process than you would have if you were using those wild type or much earlier, less domesticated birds. Well, we are using the essentially equivalent of wild chickens here with our microbes, because these have not been domesticated. These microbes have not been optimized for all the things that we are looking for, which is high protein accumulation, rapid growth, good taste and texture, and so on. So we are just scratching the surface right now of what is possible through the world of microbial fermentation to actually create a meat-like experience. And we've done it so well with so little investigation into what is actually optimizable in the world of fungi fermentation. So I really believe that people are going to be quite pleased to eat this kind of product. And while, of course, there are some people who are going to be, who are trying to be creating skepticism about these type of foods, they want to refer to them, you know, as frankenfoods and so on. The reality is that generally people are concerned about things with which they are unfamiliar, but as they become familiar, they become more comfortable with them. I'll give you an example. So if you rewind the clock, let's say 150 years, nearly everybody who had any access to ice was getting ice from then the natural ice industry. So you had these big operations where they would carve out big blocks of ice from nature, from frozen lakes and rivers, and put them on insulated boats and ship them all around the world. Well, when that ice got to people, they put it in their home ice box, and that was the way that they kept cool, or they kept their produce cool. Well, enter the advent of industrial refrigeration, and all of a sudden, you had a much cheaper way to get ice. Simply, instead of getting it from nature, you now are using human-made technology to cool water down and get ice. Well, the ice barons of that era, and there were ice barons, they were livid over this technological innovation, and they railed against what they called artificial ice. They told people it was unnatural, it went against God, it could sicken you, you didn't want your kids to have it. And of course, you fast forward to today, and we all have artificial ice makers in our homes. We call them freezers. We don't think there's anything unnatural about it at all. In fact, we probably wouldn't even consider living without one. Well, in the same way that for generations and for millennia even, the only way that we had to get ice was out of nature, then we invented technology that allows us to make it in a more efficient way. For millennia, the only way we've had to get meat is out of animals' bodies. And now human-made technology is allowing us to make meat in a much more efficient way. And I don't think it matters so much whether it is literally anatomically identical to meat as in the cases with cultivated meat, or whether it's just a meat-like experience that is produced through microbial fermentation or even through plant-based meat, as long as it satisfies the meat tooth, again, of the diner who is enjoying that experience. Just in the same way that, we want a car. We don't really think about whether it has gasoline or whether it's powered by electricity. We're looking for the experience of something that's going to take us from point A to point B. The same is so here with meat, that people just want that satisfying, satiating, craveable experience. And I believe that we can deliver it to them, not by going big with animal agriculture, but by growing small with cellular agriculture and microbial proteins and other types of non-animal methods of protein production that will enable us to utilize a tiny little fraction of the land, water, and other resources needed to produce meat than are needed today. Because again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are not going to have other celestial bodies to farm for many decades to come, and yet we need more land now. So what we can do is essentially shrink our footprint on the planet to have humanity take up less of the land mass and the water mass of planet Earth, to return much of the farmland that we have been utilizing in order to rewild it, to let native animals come re-inhabit those lands, to have more carbon get sequestered in the forests and the wetlands that we have taken over for our purposes in order to grow food in a way that might have made sense in the past, but is just far too inefficient for us to utilize it going into the future. I really believe that these types of technologies will allow us to have a different kind of relationship with the rest of the species on the planet. Whereas in the past, we've basically only thought about ourselves and only thought about Homo sapiens. In the future, I believe that we will be considering the impact of our actions, not just on other human beings, but on the rest of the animal kingdom as well, and that we will have a far better relationship with the fellow creatures on this planet, one that's no longer based just on violence and domination, the way that our relationship is based with most other animals today, but rather one that's based upon compassion and respect, and that allows them the ability to continue eking out an existence on a human-dominated planet and allow them to have some amount of land to go back to it. And this will happen in such a dramatic fashion because of things like cellular agriculture and microbial fermentation and plant-based protein, that I think that the Earth will actually look different from space. That if you go up to the International Space Station, there will be so many more trees on the planet that it will actually look different from space when you're looking down at the Earth because of these technologies. I'm excited to be a part of this type of a clean protein future. If you are at this conference, I presume that you too are excited to be a part of this clean protein future. And I would invite you to get more involved, whether that's starting your own company, joining one of the companies in this space. Maybe it's investing in companies in this space. Maybe it's just touting these companies online and social media, or maybe you want to write a book to promote the space. The space needs more advancement, because my biggest fear about all of this, as you can tell, I'm very optimistic about the fact that these technologies are coming online and getting greater and greater scale, that we can actually start making a dent and reducing the number of animals used for food. But my biggest fear is that we simply don't have the luxury of time on our side, that we may not be able to get this done fast enough before there's some irrevocable turning point. I live in California, where the wildfire season is no longer a season. It's now the entire year round. It was so bad this weekend, I couldn't even walk my dog outside because the air quality was so bad. We just are living in a time where we have massive tornadoes, massive hurricanes, pandemics, wildfires, and more. Things that, as a result of our abuse of this planet, are getting far and far worse. And we have to find ways to allow the planet to not be so human dominated, and to allow nature to retake parts of the planet that we have occupied for so long. So the urgency of our time, I believe, is to figure out how we can wean ourselves off of two of the most destructive technologies that humanity has ever pursued, which is the burning of fossil fuels and raising of billions of animals for food. These two technologies may have served us well in the past, but going into the future, we simply cannot rely on them anymore. And we need alternatives to them that are going to be quickly adoptable, economically efficient, and popular among a widespread portion of the population. I hope to help create that type of a clean protein future, and I hope you do too. If you want to be a part of it, I'd welcome you to get in touch with me. I would love to work with you in any way. If you're interested in working with the Better Meat Co. in any capacity, as an employee, as an investor, as a customer, we want to hear from you and hear from you. So check out bettermeat.co. Again, that's bettermeat.co. And I'd love to talk with you about how we can build a better future for humanity and the rest of the planet all together and create a world where the human footprint is less than it is now, and we have a higher quality of life for all of us, both human and non-human alike. So thanks so much for listening. I appreciate it. I'll turn it over. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I'd love to see people are starting to ask questions. Okay, so what do you think should happen to make cell culture more affordable for meat consumption? In short, a number of things need to happen. So first and foremost, just like with animal agriculture, the biggest cost associated with cell culture is the media that you're feeding them, the food, the feedstock that the cells are getting for their nutrition. And the problem is that this has been an industry that has really relied on biomedical technologies. Well, biomedical technologies have not had the pressure on them to actually reduce cost. People are willing to spend a lot of money on medicine. They're not willing to spend a lot of money on food. So this is an industry that, rightly so, has relied on biomedical technologies and now needs to apply that to food technologies, food type technologies. So that means coming up with types of media that will still promote rapid growth of the cells, but without the need for such expensive costs, so such expensive ingredients. So that really is, I think, one of the key things that needs to happen. And of course, the companies in this space are already working very feverishly on that. They're bringing their costs far down compared to where they were even just 3 to 5 years ago. So I'm optimistic that they can do it. I'm talking to you on a smartphone right now that, if this had been 15 years ago, might have cost $1 billion. Whereas today they're affordable enough that probably every single person listening to this talk is sitting with one of these supercomputers in their pockets. So I think it's possible to bring these costs down for these type of technologies. Just takes a lot of work for sure. Well, I'll tell you something. So first of all, thank you for the question. As I mentioned, our microbial protein that we produce here in Sacramento is already produced for cheaper than the cost of beef. So I'm pretty bullish on the use of fungi for a variety of reasons, but they're a lot cheaper to culture than animal cells are. So this is why corn, QUORN, has been able to make a great business doing fungi fermentation, where they have products in dozens of countries. But we have a different process. I'm a big admirer and respecter of corns, but we have a different process here at the Better Meat Co. And we think we think there are some key advantages to it. Now, in terms of consumer acceptance, I guess we can only rely on what actually happens. Do people accept corn? I mean, it's a wildly popular company. Their company got acquired 6 years ago for more than $800 million US, and they're doing phenomenally well. They just had a big IPO also that got them a lot of new cash. They're spending $335 million in the United States to expand their reach here. So seems like people are interested in eating it. And then when you look at other times when people have wanted to sell even cell cultured meat, people line up to try to get in line for it. I don't believe everybody will be eager to eat these foods, but you don't need everybody. We did a tasting at a steakhouse here in Sacramento less than 2 weeks ago, where we served mycoprotein steaks. So these are whole cut, not ground. They're whole cut meat mimicries made from our fungi protein. And the place was packed. It was mobbed with people trying to get in. It was just it was a temporary menu item. And the first day it was on, you could barely get a table. That's how many people came there wanting to try this steak. So I agree with you. I don't think everybody will want it, but I think there's a lot of people who will. And in the same way that, if we could even have a 20% reduction in the number of animals who we need for food, it would do a lot to relieve the pressure that we're placing on the planet. So it doesn't require 100% acceptance or even majority acceptance before we can start making a difference, I think. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So you're right. These are animal activists who are opposed to this. and they're already vegans. So it doesn't really matter whether they eat queen meat or not. These are people who don't eat meat, and queen meat is not intended for them. It's intended for meat consumers. If people are already enjoying bean and rice burritos all the time, that's great. We don't need them to switch. So, the goal of cultivated meat is not to get vegans to eat it, it's to get meat eaters to eat it. So the fact that they are academics and they still have concerns about it, I saw a PhD on the news arguing against vaccines the other day. So, it doesn't really mean much to me. I think that these are folks who are not the target for this particular industry, and they are folks who just are not going to be persuaded. That's all there is to it. I think that their critiques are invalid. I have looked at them. I don't think that they are relevant or even factually informed a lot of the times, but that's okay. They're welcome to criticize it, but they will be a tiny little minority. Just think about what a small minority of the human population vegans are already, and then the number of vegans who also are going to oppose queen meat because they think that it's exploitative of animals. I think you're dealing in a fraction of 1% there.
Yes. My question is, what kind of regulations are required for hybrid proteins? Are they the same as the plant-based ones?
Yeah, great question. So it varies by country, but I'll tell you about the United States. So in the US, there are some products that you cannot call them a certain name if they don't have a certain percentage of meat in them. So for example, a hamburger in the United States can only be 100% beef. If it has anything else in it, you can't call it a hamburger. So you can get around that though. You can call it things like burger, or one fast food company that made a blended burger. So it's 25% not meat and 75% meat. They just called it the slider. So, there's other ways to get around these standards of identity that are clever and convenient. But I do think we need a reevaluation of standards of identity, which typically are antiquated and outdated and need an overhaul to bring them more into the modern era. Because, if somebody calls a Beyond Burger a hamburger, does anybody really feel misled? I don't think so. So those need an update. But yes, there are certain areas that are tricky from a regulatory standpoint that you have to keep in mind when doing hybrid products. Appreciate all that you're doing to help build a better world. And I look forward to working with you all to create that cleaner protein future. Thank you again, friends. Have a great rest of your Monday.